Welcome back to The Dive. Today's guest will deep dive into the cannabis sector, from cannabis stocks reacting to the Fed rate hikes, the possibility of cannabis entering the Asian market, federal legalization, the Safe Banking Act, and the company's most recent ETF. She is the co-founder and managing partner of Poseidon Asset Management. Emily Paxhia is joining us today. But before we bring you Emily's video, do me a quick favor and just go ahead and subscribe below. That would be awesome. Hey, Emily, welcome back to The Dive.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us again. Okay, so let's dive right into it. Among the headlines are hot CPI and PPI. So we have to ask, do you think cannabis stocks are immune to a rotation from growth to value ahead of these expected rate hikes?
I mean, we've already rotated from growth to value in terms of how we're getting rated in the public markets. They're trading like value stocks, even though we do have growth. And yeah, the consumer spending is definitely something that's interesting to be watching, and the way that consumers are viewing inflation and experiencing it is definitely something to be watching. But in cannabis, we feel it on our supply chain side, but I haven't seen prices going up yet in terms of what's happening at the register. It's usually already been so much impacted by the tax rates that it's just one of those things that it's already fairly baked in. And I don't think we can really raise prices too much in cannabis because it is already quite pricey by the time you bake everything into the final ticket. So.
Okay, so according to a report published by Deloitte Canada, cannabis has contributed $43.5 billion to Canada's GDP and $13.3 billion to Ontario since legalization. These are some big numbers. Why do you think there aren't better equity stories coming out of Canada?
I think that the performance of the stocks is reflective of the performance of the operators in Canada. There was a lot of money that flowed very early into these companies, and you saw a lot of parabolic growth in the names, like Tilray at one point hitting $300 a share. So there was a lot of excitement around these stocks, and also like Sundial last year is another one that was a benefit of the meme stock wave. And so those stocks have had amazing moments of growth. And then it comes down to what do you do with the resources that you have, the capital that you have. And I don't necessarily think that the Canadian operators have been the best shepherds of capital in terms of putting that into building strong fundamentals. Instead, we've seen a ton of funded capacity being built. And like in the case of like Aurora, you've seen it's now just a fallow facility that's not even being utilized because it was too much essentially. So I think that, it's one of those things where it cuts both ways. When capital flows in a very efficient and productive way, if you can put that to use in terms of building operations that have standing fundamentals, I think then it gets treated better. But I think we haven't seen a ton of that. I mean, even just Cannabis Growth Corp with their announcement for their quarter, I mean, they saw a 1% improvement in still negative EBITDA. It's just not that interesting from an investment perspective, in my personal opinion. But I really like I like looking at company fundamentals, and I like looking at the growth story that's building around that.
Okay, so the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health raised concerns about the illegal sale of cannabis edibles on online platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok in the UK. Do you think the gray market poses a problem to legal businesses?
The gray market always poses as an issue to legal businesses, and we see that very much here. Well, gray market or even just plain old illicit market poses a significant threat to the licensed operators in any province in Canada or any state in the United States or any country, frankly. And I think that this is something that we have to be concerned about. I'm concerned about it from a couple of angles. One, I think when operators are not working within the legal framework, it leaves a gap open to have products that are entering into a market that are not necessarily for the best of the consumers. We saw this in the vape hysteria that happened in 2019 in California and the United States, when there were gray or illicit market vapor products entering the market. They had compounds in it that were dangerous to human lungs. And then we saw people getting sick from this, and it was a real concern. What it did highlight is the benefit of having these legal and regulated markets with real lab testing requirements, such that you have to understand what's in the products that are entering into the market, and so that the consumers are safest. I wouldn't want to consume anything that's in an illicit or illegal or gray market in food, let alone in something I'm inhaling into my lungs. So especially when you think about it in the back, like we're cycling through these waves of a pandemic, where the pandemic in this instance is very impactful on our respiratory system. It's like, I want everything to point in the direction of respiratory health. So I do not want illicit products. So I think it's a threat to the legal operators. And I also think it's a threat to consumers. I think consumers should take the power into their own hands to work within the regulated framework so that they're getting the best products they can find.
Okay, so let's shift to legalization. Last week, Thailand's health minister signed a measure officially dropping cannabis from a list of controlled drugs in the country. Do you think Thailand is one step closer to being the first Asian country to decriminalize marijuana? How close are you following the Asian market?
I follow the Asian market pretty closely, just because I really actually love the Asian market in general from a lifestyle and culture thing. I've traveled extensively through the Philippines, Cambodia, Thailand, and others. But I just think that when you dig in, it's really hemp that they decriminal. I mean, it's because it's a very low threshold of THC. And so if I'm walking around with a product from California, I'm still definitely breaking the law in that instance. And because we see such high percentages of THC. And I think that these are the nuances we have to look for. I think it's an interesting move. I think they're probably looking at it more from the CBD or industrial hemp side of things, that they're trying to take the bite out of the law on it. But I think you also have to, so we watch the markets carefully. There are a lot of nuances to understanding what it means to look at these markets and the way that laws are formed. And there's, for example, in Thailand, they have a history of having massive turnovers of the government, with coups happening at the federal level, overthrowing of regimes of power. And like the last time when I was in Bangkok, there weren't even street vendors of food were not even allowed, because the most recent regime had decided that was not going to be acceptable and wiped it out. And so you have to understand the way that culturally countries move through lawmaking, implementing laws, and then the cycles of it. And I think that Asia operates very different. Most Asian cultures, I should say, and their governments and legal systems operate quite differently than they do here in the United States or in Canada. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's an exciting step, and I think it's just one more indication that stigma is being dropped around cannabis. But I would say I would be very cautious around what I would predict comes next out of that.
Okay, so let's shift back to the United States talk here. Yeah. Chuck Schumer sent a letter to his fellow Senate members urging them to provide input and suggestions on a new bill that would legalize cannabis at a federal level. Do you think this is a step closer to Fed legalization? Are you hearing any good headway behind the scenes on discussions involving social reforms?
Oh boy, I'm a bear on federal reform in cannabis. I think Chuck Schumer is doing everything he can to stay to curry favor amongst the populace, which is substantially in favor of decriminalizing and legalizing cannabis here in the United States. He keeps talking about he's going to make a big announcement again on 420. I'm just like, he's so out of date. It's so behind the times. And I'm like, I'm overcomplicating an issue is all I can think of when I think of the way that Schumer's approached this, and I'm immensely disappointed by it. I'm much more interested in what Congresswoman Mace has been doing, because she seems like she's taking a much more pragmatic approach to the concept of decriminalizing and legalizing cannabis. So I'm pretty bearish on what I think we see from the federal level. At this point, I would just gladly take banking reform. I mean, we just saw in Washington state, there's been a rash of violent crimes. And all of this is around the fact that people and criminals understand that these businesses are, the product is high value, but more, there's cash. There is cash in the system. And where there's cash in the system, you're attracting criminal activity. And it's reached a tipping point, I think.
So let's talk about cannabis ETFs. They've really bounced in recent weeks, with most of the major funds making double-digit comebacks. Do you think that this is due to the reintroduction and passing of SAFE in the House of Representatives last week, and maybe discussions around other cannabis-related bills?
Yes, I do think that people are waiting for indications of change. Like, look, I've been at this for 8 years. I'm kind of like the the woman who's been around for a while, and I'm a little bit jaded. But I think that others who are waiting for an opportunity to participate, they are waiting for indications of federal change. Further to that, they are liking, I think, these ETF strategies because they're seeing it's a nice way to get exposure to the industry. And also, most of the ETFs are trading on the listed exchanges, unlike the US underlying portfolio companies. And, as an ETF manager, I've been very excited by the performance I'm seeing in year to date. It was a very difficult end of 2021, but 2022 is showing, kind of a new foundation and a new traction point. And so I'm pretty happy about what we're seeing and what we're seeing across the cohort of ETFs in the space. Well, not all, but I do think there are a couple that are really the ones that kind of lead the pack.
So one of the important points that we noted in your prospectus is that you may leverage your ETF up to 150%. Can you explain how you think about leverage as a component of your overall strategy?
Leverage is our way of indicating our conviction on the sector. It's like so at this point, our portfolio is comprised entirely of US MSOs. I think we have one exception to that, but it's really, when you look at the way that we've invested the capital, it's based on over 8 years of experience of watching the sector, of investing actively in the sector, of navigating the multiple cycles we've gone through. And then because of that, we feel that leverage is just a further indication of conviction. And so if you're an investor looking to get in to the space and you think that these names are undervalued, yes, they'll move up. But if you have leverage, they move up 150% versus just one step up. So you have an exponential lift on this. And so it's something to think about if you're very high conviction on the sector, if you're high conviction on the top cohort of US MSOs, it's a great strategy to be looking at for that, because that's how we believe we will see the growth of the industry and outperform too. So.
Okay, great. So one more thing before we let you go here, Emily. What should investors be watching out for with Poseidon in the near term?
I think we're just going to continue to lean into the space. We invest everywhere from early stage through to the capital markets. And my brother, who's my business partner, always likes to say that we always wanted Poseidon to be a great destination for anybody who's looking to participate in the investment landscape of the cannabis industry. And so we will just keep leaning in where we see opportunity lies. It's interesting. A year ago today, the stocks were still going up at a pretty impressive clip day after day. And then we saw the drawdown because of the custody issues around Archegos and the whole Credit Suisse thing. But I think that, a year ago, right around now, I had turned to my brother and I said, did we miss the last opportunity to establish more of a bite into this market? And then we saw the drawdown again, another bear cycle in cannabis. But here we are today, and we're doing just that. We're continuing to invest further into the industry, and we think it's a great time to be entering. So we're leaning in.
Awesome. Well, lots to look forward to. Well, thank you so much for joining us again, Emily. It's been a pleasure talking to you again.
Thank you so much for having me. We'll talk soon.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. We'll be back again tomorrow with the latest, so be sure to hit that notification bell before you go.